It is still Easter explained. And even though our lockdown in South Africa was extended by 2 weeks, we will hold strong and stay home and stay safe, while celebrating Easter the way we should, but smarter and a bit more virtual, but still for everyone to see. You see, because the purpose of Easter, as we've explained in some of the earlier videos, and you can truly go watch them, is that festivals like Easter and Passover, the purpose of them is to teach our children, to remind ourselves, to renew our faith, and to spread hope. Hope in the stories that we know, hope in the stories that we do not yet know, and courage from that hope to face the challenges for our day. So during the night, because the events from the Last Supper on Thursday night, the Passover meal on Thursday night, through to the crucifixion is just too much for a short video. During the night, I shared the details, or some of the details, of how it worked with Judas betraying Jesus, one of the 12. Peter denying Jesus. The rest running away of his followers. If you read Mark, you'll read how he lost his clothes and ran away naked, because as one of the followers of Jesus, he just did not have the courage for the challenge ahead. Jesus, falsely accused now and dragged through a long, tedious, torturous interrogation at the high priest's house. The priests decide that he's just too much of a threat and he's just too much of a conflict for them, so they are going to ask for his execution. The high priests and the leaders were not in charge. They had to ask the Romans. So by Roman law, at Passover time, they would let go one of the prisoners. They would free them as a sign of goodwill towards the Jews. And the only other person except for Jesus that would be liable of parole, as it will, was a psychopathic murderer. And so it's ironic that the Jews would choose him. But the story unfolds differently. So first, in the early hours while we were all still sleeping, some of us stayed awake throughout the night, as some Christians do celebrate Easter that way, the dawn of Easter, reading through the text. And in the early hours, Jesus was dragged in front of Pontius Pilate, who was governor of Jerusalem. He immediately noticed that it's either going to be a riot, and that where these kind of displays were usually peaceful on their sacred Passover celebrations, this year it would not be the same. He sent Jesus to his superior, to Herod, who laughs off the situation, who sends him back to Pilate and says, "It's not my problem, sort it out." Jesus is then lashed 40 times in hope from Pontius that when his skin is broken, and he's been lashed with whips that has metal pieces on it and gouges skin from skin, that the Jews would be appeased, but the church leaders weren't, because they didn't get it. And driven by their greed and their desperation to survive, and some of them their lack of realization, of awareness, the Jews shout and riot for the crucifixion of their king. Jesus gets mocked. A thorn crown gets shoved into his head. He gets beaten beyond recognition of a human being. And yet when he gets to the place where they crucify him, to the place Golgotha, where they hit the nails into his hands, instead of cursing people, Jesus prays for them so that they would realize what they've done. But that God would forgive them because they do not realize what they have done. After that, he speaks forgiveness to one of the robbers that's hanged next to him, or hung next to him. He then speaks to his mother and asks his friend to care for him, asks for something to drink, which he gets vinegar, as if his daughter is not enough. Because people's spiteful arrogance, superiority complexes, whatever the problem is keeping them from believing Jesus, gets in the way. After this, Jesus says, my God, why do you abandon me?" It gets so bad and so dark because around noon, it says that the weather turned. There's a storm coming up. And when the storm comes up and Jesus asks this in this dark day, as the weather has become very dark and gloomy for much of South Africa. By now, many of the onlookers has gone home in fear that the storm would hit him. Judas, we are told by accounts, has committed suicide because when he realized what he has done, he went and tried to fix it. But the church leaders who weren't even at the cross, who has left by now, did not want to recant. It was too late. There was no remorse. And the remorse that Judas felt was just too much. He did not get the gravity of Jesus' forgiveness. And after he asks why God has left him, asks for something to drink, Jesus says this. He says tetelestai in the Greek, which means it is done. It is completed. He has completed his mission, which we do not understand yet in our story. And lastly, even though Jesus himself experiences emotion so deeply, feeling that he is abandoned by God, he leaves his spirit into God's hands. He left his spirit into God's hands. And he asks that God takes his body and his spirit, and he passes away. From here on, it gets dark and stormy, and there's an earthquake when he dies. Suddenly, everyone realizes the shock and the horror. And in the temple, the earthquake is so bad. The temple has a curtain between where normal people may go and the holy priests may go. And that curtain is torn from the one side of the temple to the other, destroying the divide between people and God. One of Jesus' followers asks forgiveness and asks permission to put his body in a grave before the Sabbath comes, because at sunset it's Sabbath. And after Sabbath, there's radio silence. A couple of high priests break Sabbath rules to ask for soldiers to be put on guard at Jesus' grave, so that they do not rob the body. Because they started remembering what Jesus said, and they themselves got afraid. And in Sabbath it was silent and people hid away, too afraid to see, because dead people rose from the graves. The earthquake opened up graves. Dead people were visiting their families on Sabbath. I would be hiding too if my dead grandma got out of the grave and came knocking. Didn't even get the honor to meet her properly, but it would scare the daylights out of me. But this all happened, and the story continues.